think about this anti-immigrant rhetoric, Puerto Rico as a island of garbage, all of these things that you keep hearing Trump harp on and dwell on and focus on, the eugenic nature of his rhetoric. I say, not only to Jonathan's point, does that speak to the individual, that speaks to who America is and always has been.
Well, you know what? I'm looking through a prism of the changing of our moral compass. You know, Democrats and Republicans, whatever their political differences might have been, there used to be a time in Washington that after they left the House or after they left the Senate, they might go have dinner together. Their families might vacation together. They knew each other. You know, they might differ on some policies, but at the end of the day, everybody were human beings, and there was a amount of decency that we treated with each other with. You know, the party that used to call itself the moral majority now has no morals. I mean, look who their leader is.
If it ever did.
And it just surprises me when I hear Trump speaking, and even not just Trump, but just some other Republicans, and Marjorie Taylor Greene or some of the other people that are there will say things, and I wonder, how do you explain that to your kids? You know, watching some of the voting coverage today, a lot of folks took their kids with them to the polls, you know, teaching them a sense of social responsibility and how big it is to have your say in the government. And I'm wondering, how do these people take their kids home and explain, grab them by the, you know, those kinds of comments, or calling people vermin or threatening to kill people? It just goes on and on and on. And so that's the prism I'm looking through. It has nothing to do with policy. It's about people.
Well, but to the things that we have Representative Derek Jackson that's a great question, and let's get back to that. Representative Jackson, good evening, joining us from the 68th district in Georgia.
Good evening. Glad to be with you all, and just listening to the conversation. I agree with what has been said. You know, I often think about our ancestors that did not have the opportunity to even be considered as a full citizen. I mean, let us not forget, in the Constitution, we were known as 3/5 of a person. And then the other fraction in the Constitution is 1/8. That's all you needed in terms of the drop of blood to be considered Black or Negro. And so I'm just so elated to be with you all on this historic election. You know, as a state representative, Doc, you and I talked briefly. I mean, this is a true testament. This is an answer to our ancestors' prayer. Those who could not walk through the front door of an establishment, those who had to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar or the bubbles on a bar of soap, those who were considered less than or other, those who were murdered and lynched. This goes well beyond just, as you always talking about, this goes well beyond just policy and legislation. This is another exclamation mark in this country for those who say we can't. And we know that we always had to be 2 or 3 times more educated, more smarter, more faster. This demonstrates that we can, if you give us an opportunity, if you remove the barriers, we as a people collectively across these United States. And Doc, the other point I just want to highlight, just by listening to you all, my 5-year-old grandson is going to look back at this moment And he's going to realize that we fought, we showed up, so that he too can live out whatever dreams that God has called for him to live out. I'm just happy to be with you, brothers. I'm just bursting with joy.
So we're glad to have you with us. I have a question for you, Mr. Jackson. That there is a bill, and well, let me get here first. The Supreme Court made a decision a few weeks ago about allowing the state of Virginia to purge, last-minute purge of voters. Clear violation of the law, but the Supreme Court ruled to let it pass. That decision was repeated in Ohio. And I'm wondering if you're concerned that of the ripple effect of that, now that the Supreme Court has given a green light to it, how many other states might we look at where there'll be last-minute purges of citizens based on the Republican complaint that, well, non-citizens are voting, which we know is very rare, but regular, real citizens are being caught up in that. And of course, the Trump administration or Trump people will try to use that and say, well, now that's proof of voter fraud.
Your question is an excellent question. And let me tell you, I am very concerned on the recent actions of this Supreme Court these last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, let's go back to July of 2013, when the Supreme Court then decided to remove a provision out of the Voting Rights Act that required for states to make their submission to the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Department of the DOJ, when it came to voting rights. But when the Supreme Court removed that provision, it certainly signaled to all 48 of the 50 states, came out immediately with their own tailored Jim Crow 2.0 bills to make it harder to vote. I mean, when you think about where we are in this society, where the election process is open, is free, is fair, and secure. And it's been like that for a long time. But when they removed that provision, that pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 48 out of 50 states immediately went to work to make it more difficult. Here in Georgia is another case in point. They came out with a 98-page document, Senate Bill 202, to where you can't even give out water or granola. You can't, for those who standing in lines for hours and hours and hours. I mean, how incredulous is that? But to the essence of your other part of your question is this. If they allow for a state like Virginia, a commonwealth, let us not forget, it's a commonwealth, that if they did not have same-day voter registration, those individuals that they purge within 90 days, you typically do not make any changes to the role and policies, your state election boards, within 90 days of the general election. But we witness across these United States this year how state election boards were making changes. And now you're going to have the Supreme Court, the ultimate court of the land, to uphold the breaking of the law. But if Virginia did not have that provision that allowed for their citizens, even after they've been purged, for same-day voter registration, those citizens, unfortunately, will not have the opportunity to participate, because not all states have the same laws. Not all states have the same requirements. And so it's very concerning that the Supreme Court allowed for that to happen.
And this is the National Voter Rights Registration Act. So this is a federal law.
It's a federal law.
It just surprises me that the Supreme Court would just overlook that. But I guess that's where we are, the partisanship on the part of the Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, if you think about Project 2025, they are really communicating what they want to do. They want to go against the rule of law. They've already done that this past summer when they said that an individual with 34 felonies is above the law. I mean, we've watched that this year where 4 indictments, 88 felonies, potentially, they basically put all those cases on ice with exception of one. They did not anticipate for the one in New York to get by like it did. But the one in Florida, which is appalling, because that one, out of all the indictments, is very unnerving, because I'm a retired naval officer. I did 22 years, retired commander. This individual, the former commander-in-chief of the United States, had top secret classified material in bathrooms, living rooms, in a very unsecured location. We normally, if you have one piece of paper of classified material, we immediately put you in Leavenworth. And so what is that communicating to the military, the Department of Defense? What is that communicating to those who are already serving time, for those who broke the law already? And so if you look at Project 2025, they're communicating where they want to take this country. We just got to stop them at every time the ballot box is open.
One thing about Project, go ahead, Jonathan.
Representative Jackson, you mentioned your grandson, and you talked about this being a historic moment. I want you to be the editor at my newspaper, for those of us who remember actual newspapers, and write 2 headlines for me. The first headline, Kamala Harris wins. What are you and your grandson talking about 20 years from now when you go pull that newspaper out? And then let's flip it around. What if we leave this evening and she misses the mark? What are the 2 conversations you're having 20 years from now with your then adult grandson about this moment?
You know, when you think about the forward, when the headline says Kamala Harris wins, 20 years from now, I could tell my grandson that those who said that President Barack Obama presidency was a fluke, a mistake, a red herring, we can then come back and say, oh, no, it wasn't, because in 2024, we showed that it was not a mistake. It was not a fluke. It demonstrates the power of the collective voice. It demonstrates that the sky's the limit. I can tell my grandson 20 years from now to say that whatever you put your heart, your soul, your mind to, you can do it even in these United States. Let's say tonight she loses, which I doubt, because based on what we already know, based on internal polling. But let's just say, then we'll say to my grandson that our vote matters, and if you believe that it doesn't because we didn't show up, she lost. I will remind my grandson of 1877, the compromise. I'll remind my grandson that it was one vote that ended the Reconstruction era. One vote. That's it. And so I would demonstrate with your newspaper 20 years from now, if she should lose, to tell him that your vote matters. One individual can make a change, just as Frederick Douglass did, just as Dr. Martin Luther King did, Nelson Mandela, and a host of others. And so that's what we'll be able to tell my grandson. But we'll be able to tell my grandson that victory belongs to us because she will win.
Gentlemen, if you don't mind, I want to. Can I just follow up? Just one real quick follow up here, just real quickly. Representative Jackson, I'm one of these folks. So the argument that you've made, and I accept it. I mean, I'm 100% on board there. Is one that says symbols still matter. One of the things that has come to disturb me, part of this through line, this ongoing narrative over the past several years or so, has this been, among some fellows in our own community, has been this: Obama didn't do anything for us. Obama didn't deliver anything for us. There's an argument that some can make, a policy argument that some could make if they want to. But I would argue, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, is that symbols still do matter. Having that black man, that black family in the White House for 8 years mattered, and I would say it mattered more to little white children than it even did to us, because those same kids are at the ballot box today, and they're there thinking it's nothing out of the ordinary to vote for a black person because that's all they had for 8 years while they were growing up, from the time they were 9 until 18.
You know, I absolutely agree. In fact, to the point that you're highlighting, an organization says one of their mottos is, to be one, you must see one. To be one, you must see one. And prior to 2008, if an individual came up to me, one of my mentees, I mentor a lot of young men, young black men. If they would have came up to me prior to 2008 and said, Representative Jackson, I want to be president of the United States, what is that conversation like? Do we take out 43 presidents where that person do not see someone that resembles his pigmentation? Do he lose hope because he'll say all 43 presidents were all white men? But what happens when the conversation is after 2008? When he can now look at the pictures on the wall and see number 44, someone that looks like him, who dares to believe that if he did it, even with a very awkward name that's not like Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, but someone with a name that sounds like it's from Africa. What does that conversation look like after 2008? So yes, I truly believe, and even in, depending on where your religion may fall, but even the word says that we are a visual creature. And sometimes we need to give our vision a target. We got to be able to see what we're aiming for. And so if Frederick Douglass was around, a lot of my history points to Frederick Douglass. I can only imagine Frederick Douglass, who never been elected, was bold enough to say to the president of these United States that you have to reach a particular point in your presidency to free those who look like me. It doesn't matter that can put my subject and verbs together and I wear a bow tie and can walk into the Oval Office. This wasn't just about him. He said, I got to make the argument, make the case to where you can let go everyone that looks like me. And so, and Frederick Douglass did not have a symbol to point towards. but he had a divine inspiration, realizing that he was bold enough. He exercised courage to walk into that office and say, "You got to let my people go."
Representative,
do you
I want to throw just another little piece of demographic, jumping on to follow up on what Jonathan asked. Yes, you have a lot of young white folks who saw their first president, or the first one they voted for, was a black man. On the flip side of that, let me ask you, looking into the future as a young man yourself, what kind of electorate, what kind of mood can we expect when these young people now are seeing campaigns with the kind of nastiness? It's like the new nasty that Trump has brought. Well, he didn't initiate it, but he has taken it to another level. The name calling, the viciousness, the ugliness. Is that here to stay now? Do these young people, is that what they have to look forward to, or can we turn that back?
If I often use my own family as an example. I have 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons. The oldest is 30, the youngest is 18. And when I see in my own 7 children how they look at the world, every generation moving further and further away from and understanding what civil rights was all about. If you look at social media, you see a blend of these young people, how they party together. You have individuals learning our culture, how to rap, how to sing,
Sure,
the food that we eat.
But I'm not
And
talking
so,
about I'm not talking about civil rights. I'm talking about civility.
right. I'm coming your way. And so when you think about the ugliness that has resurfaced these last 9 years since Trump came down that escalator, a lot of these individuals that voted today for Kamala Harris, they were just 8 and 9 years of age. They didn't have a good sense of what misogyny and racism and hatred and ugliness. 9 years later, they're at an age of 18 and 19, and they realize that that's not them. That goes against what they know. And some of these young people, if you look at TikTok, they voted in opposite of their parents.
Mm-hmm. And maybe Trump's done us a favor.
Right. He really has, because and so now where the parents can't tell their children how to vote, because these children said, I'm canceling out my Republican dad vote. In fact, there were some children that turned in their fathers that were at the January 6th, 2021 insurrection.
Right. That's right.
There were children that turned in their own parents. And so I believe this is going to be short-lived because this next generation just did not consume this hatred of their parents the way their parents consumed this hatred. And their parents are the parents that were the ones who were old enough to have the fire hoses on our parents. They're the ones who watch different doors to be used depending on the pigmentation of your skin. They grew up with white only and black only water fountains. And so that generation is dying off. And the blessing is the next generation coming along saying, we are not our parents. We are not our grandparents.
A couple of things. One, to that point, if you think back to the Obama administrations in Florida, many were saying there was no way Barack Obama could win Florida.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the Euro-Cubans that the elder Euro-Cubans that put Barack Obama over the top both times in Florida. It was their children
Mm-hmm.
that voted for Barack Obama. If you look at the demographic breakout and you look at the age demographic, it was the children of those
Mm-hmm.
Cuban refugees that voted for Barack Obama. Let me ask you this, Representative Jackson, you do represent District 68 in Georgia, so you do know the Georgia vote counting process. Right now, they're showing Trump 55, Harris 44. But they're saying that Georgia is too close to call. If you could, with your insight on how Georgia processes votes, there may be a lot of people watching this in a panic mode saying, if she loses Georgia, all is lost. Can you give some insight into, is it still too early based upon how votes get counted in Georgia to make that assessment?
That's exactly right. It is too early. And what even prolonged us is that Georgia had 7 bomb threats. And these bomb threats took place in predominantly black counties, like Fulton County, which is the largest county here in Georgia, Gwinnett County, which is the third, and DeKalb, which is the second. And so we extended the hours. We allow for the polls to stay open to ensure all the votes are going to be counted. And so that's one particular reason why. The second reason why Georgia has 159 counties. There's only one other state that have more counties than Georgia, and that's Texas. And so because our system is so decentralized, it takes anywhere between 3 to 4 hours for all of the precincts to be counted. And so when you look at 159 counties, and some of our most remote counties are about 4 hours, 5 hours away, there's a process that they got to make sure that to preserve the integrity of the system, how they lock up the drives and everything, and then drive them here to Atlanta. And so I suspect that all the polls in Georgia will be closed finally. Because the other thing is, the law here in Georgia says if you are in line by 7 p.m., you are to remain in line. And I just like to remind your listening audience that 4 years ago, yours truly was in line until midnight.
Wow.
I was in line till midnight. We had lines wrapped around the building. I mean, because I was one of those traditional voters. I wanted to wait until the election day. And we did not cast our ballot until midnight 4 years ago. And so that may very well happen across Georgia. We witnessed a surge in Georgia. We had over 4 million votes during early voting. By noontime today, we had 500,000. I received a text from the Secretary of State office. By 2 p.m. today, we had over 700,000. And so we're predicting that we're going to be well over 5 million total votes. And then you got the absentee votes, ballots as well to count. And so it is too close. And the reason why it's going to remain to be too close, because the big counties here in Georgia that are predominantly black and Democratic, it takes a long time to count those ballots.
One more question about that. So in looking at MSNBC, and you mentioned the early voting, when do they start to tabulate the votes that were, the ballots that were cast through the early voting process? Have they already started processing those, or are they right now just focused on the ballots that were cast today?
Great question. And so by law, we started tabulating the early votes at 8 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay.
But again, because we had these several bomb threats here, that slowed the process down, because we want to do things the most safe way. And so we had to evacuate the one of the largest centers that we can anticipate about over 1 million votes in this particular county, Fulton County. So we had to evacuate. We had to bring in the dogs, make sure everything was clear, and then they went back in.
You know, and I'm glad that you mentioned where those bomb threats were targeted, because I was seeing articles that were attributing those bomb threats to Russian operatives. And understanding Russian history and Russia's relationship with the continent of Africa, with countries on the continent of Africa. In fact, Patrice Lumumba University is in Moscow. I seriously doubt that Russians would target the Black community to engage in any kind of nefarious voting. One more question. You mentioned Project 2025. I think it's very important for people to know that's not new. Even though it's being presented during this election as though this is something that Republicans just came up with, this has been their game plan. We can go back with the contract with America and Newt Gingrich. This is old wine in new bottles.
You know, Doc, you're exactly right, and I appreciate you highlighting that point. I remind the voters here in Georgia that the Heritage Foundation, which started back in the early 70s, started thinking about a plan for Richard Nixon, about America First plan. And then it manifested into 1981 for Ronald Reagan, the mandate for leadership, where this 3,000-page manifesto, I call it, was focusing back then in 1981 for Ronald Reagan, 4 areas. Those 4 areas included family, number 2 was patriotism. Number 3 was being fiscally conservative. And then number 4, the military. But now fast forward, in 2022, that 3,000-page document was synthesized down to 922 pages. And they started going to work saying that if they can get Trump a second term, what they did not know what to do the first time, they will have a plan the second time. And so that 3,000 page turned into 922 pages, but they became a little bit more egregious. They were going to go after the heart of the Constitution. They were going after the 4th Amendment. They were going after the 13th Amendment. They were going after the 14th Amendment. They're going after the 15th Amendment. And oh yeah, they're going after the 19th Amendment. They were going after the 25th Amendment. And so they wanted to take an axe against the Constitution. And howbeit it may be flawed, but it's the only document that allowed for us to have a voice today. And we took this imperfect document and we can continue to add pressure to make it a more perfect experiment, a more perfect union, a more perfect society. So that way our grandchildren will even have more rights than we have today. But when they started implementing parts of this Project 2025 under the auspice of abortion, and they put those 3 ultra-conservative justices that all lied, by the way, they started ripping away some of the legislation, hallmark legislation like Roe v. Wade, that's been around for 5 decades. And they didn't stop there. They went for affirmative action. Affirmative action. Now think about this, Doc. The affirmative action was put in place so that we may have equal access. You still got to be qualified. But even under affirmative action, we only produce 5.7% doctors, 3.4% dentists, and 1.8% lawyers. That's it.
And where do most of them come from? HBCUs.
Right? So even having the affirmative action in place, it wasn't like, you know, they were doing us any great favors, because, you know, them black elected men back during Reconstruction started putting HBCUs and land grants and everything else in place. And so when people say that Barack Obama didn't do anything for us, I urge them to look at the legislation, right? Because a lot of time when people say Barack Obama didn't do anything for us, they just got those talking points from somebody that don't know anything about legislation. And so we're going to continue as black men and black women in these United States. We want to continue to force and push these United States for a more perfect union, so we can make sure our fingerprints are on this experiment.
Representative Jackson, stick with us because I want to ask you a couple other questions, but we want to bring in Dara Kennedy. She's one of our correspondents out there with folks talking to voters. Dara, you got us?
Oh, I can hear you. Representative Derek Johnson, thank you so much for Jackson for being here. I'm sorry, I actually wanted to contribute, but the Divine Nine is actually on stage right now behind us here at Howard University. The scene here is sad. It is quite, okay, I see it, folks. It is quite packed here at the Howard University Byrd Gymnasium. I think as you were talking about the impact of HBCUs, clearly this is the epitome of what HBCUs can do and what they can produce. Vice President Harris today, just a few hours ago, released her statement as to why she would hold it here, because the capacity here is only 2,700 people. And she said, when I was a freshman at Howard University, I ran for the freshman class president. And she said, I didn't win, but if I win president of the United States, I will be the first HBCU president in the history of America. So when you talk about what the history and why, when the rest of the world is saying, why not just do it at the convention center in DC? It means so much more to her community and to people like us, why we are right here at Howard University on election night in one of the most contentious elections in our history.
You know, it's also important to remember when you look at where the stage is set up in front of Douglas Hall, that that space is incredibly sacred as it relates to African Americans. Muhammad Ali stood on those steps in front of Douglas Hall. Lyndon Johnson gave a phenomenal speech on those steps in front of Douglas Hall. I spent a lot of time on those steps in front of Douglas Hall. So a lot of history.
Well, then there it is, right there. That's all we needed to know.
There we go.
That's all we need to know. And just really quick, and I know it's loud here, and it gets loud. There's some speeches. Quite a few people that we had a special guest, and we'll try to get more of the guests back over here where it is. But quite a few people that we've connected with while covering the campaign, Wilmer and Brian and Jonathan from DNC to the RNC. A lot of the surrogates are out. So we'll try and do our best to bring them in to just, people are joyful. You know, if you guys remember Chicago, that feeling we had in Chicago, and Brian and Jonathan, you remember the feeling you had in Milwaukee. Those things were not the same, right?
Yes. Markedly different.
Right? Brian was doing this to his little bow tie. He was like, right? But the feeling that we felt in Chicago is the feeling that people have here. And there are a good number of students, but you can just feel the energy. And what I'm hoping is that the energy we feel right now does not let us down like it did in 2016, right? Because I was there for Hillary Clinton, and we had that same momentum, and everybody was ready to crack the glass ceiling, and then we were all disappointed. So hopefully this momentum that you hear and that I feel will continue.
Well, let's hope so. Thanks, Dara. We know you'll keep us up to speed on what's going on there. It looks like a party.
It is an HBCU.
We know what time it is.
Thank you, guys. I know that North Carolina is looking good for the vice president. I'm gonna try and round up some people, and music comes down. I'll pop back. Good to see you, Representative. Thank you, guys. I'll see you in a bit.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
You know, she mentioned 2016, Doc. I think this won't end like 2016. Here's the reason why. As one of our surrogates, we have incredible access to data, unlike, you know, some of the information that's shared on television. And 107 days ago, just 107 days ago, that first night, we all can recall that first night, where 45,000 Black women got on a call. They broke Zoom that night.
Mm-hmm.
They had to figure out another way to get 45,000 women. They raised $1.6 million. Now, in the grand scheme of things, people say, okay, 1.6 million. Then that following night, the clarion call started that Monday morning. Roland Martin, one of my frat brothers, and several others, and we had a call that night. And I'm sure some of you all were on there. 53,000 brothers was on that call. Now, we didn't raise 1.6 million. We raised 1.3 million. But nonetheless, ever since July 21st, over 200 organizations were formed. You had white women for Kamala Harris, cat ladies for Kamala Harris, comedians for Kamala Harris. You had dog catcher for Kamala Harris, right? What's my point? She has created a coalition in the most organic way that Barack Obama did not have, brothers. Barack Obama did not have a coalition that consisted of Dick Cheney and Michelle Obama and Taylor Swift and Beyonce. Just put that in perspective for a second. You had Black women meeting with white women, got on their call, and my wife was also on that call. She's a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and they were telling white women that Black men and Black women have been saving this democracy, and they were challenging 200,000 white women on that call that they got to do their part. And there were white women that were crying on that call saying that they failed in 2016. And they made a pledge, Doc, not to allow for 2016. Now, why is that important? Because the largest voting bloc outside of non-voters, that's a different story for a different day. But for those who vote, the largest voting bloc are white women.
Mm-hmm.
White women. And Black women on that call during that same week of July 21st, that same week, were holding them to task. And we know these were some strong women that were telling them, we've been saving this democracy and we need you all to be with us. And I must tell you, during the course of this 107 days, you've been seeing the Liz Cheney. I mean, they've been going out more than just endorsing. They've been on the campaign trail. So 2016, we would refer to that as the seminal work.
Well,
and you make a really good point, Representative, and we should remind folks, Black women have been on the forefront of this in more ways than one. If you recall, who was the Hollywood mogul, the guy that went to, I guess he went to prison, didn't he?
Weinstein.
Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah. Harvey Weinstein.
Wow.
You remember, the sisters were in front of that when that whole thing started, and had to bring the white ladies to join them. So, so we have to give them props to being the support on those kinds of efforts. And you raise an interesting point.
Women, Brian, just to that women's issue. One is Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, but she won the popular vote with 66 million votes. So as a woman, She won the popular vote with 66 million. She lost the Electoral College. And let me also just say, before you go to your question to Representative Derek Jackson, 06, my brother, 06. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, wow. Is that what we're doing here now?
only when it's relevant. Only when it's relevant. Only when it's relevant.
I'm glad we got a little 2 and 2 going on here right now. Hey, you know,
I wanted to ask you a follow up
go
to
ahead,
this
yeah.
about a follow up to your comment about how Hollywood and this social media thing has grown around this. Harrison Ford, who has never made any comment in his whole career about politics, said this just yesterday. I never really wanted to talk about it much, but when dozens of former members of the Trump administration are sounding alarms saying, for God's sake, don't do this again, you have to pay attention. And I have to believe that resonates even among Republicans. And we see a lot of them signing these letters saying, yes, we're going to support Kamala Harris because it's bigger than just the person.
You know, and you're raising an excellent point about those who never used their platform, never endorsed, never got involved into this political arena. And I often remind folks that as a retired military officer, we never got involved in politics, right? We have always been apolitical. But when you see 200 generals and admirals, some of my contemporaries, those who I serve with, those who I know, and I never knew what their party affiliation, because in the military, you just do not talk about politics. Right. You don't talk about sex, and you don't talk about religion. Those three you never talk about. And it's been like that for decades. But when you get over 200 generals and admirals, and then the commander, the Joint Chief of Staff, the most senior military officer, referred to the former commander-in-chief as a fascist.
There you go.
If that doesn't send shockwaves, okay, so it's one thing.
And said he's not qualified.
Right. And so when you think about that, so it's one thing for an athlete or a celebrity to make an endorsement, but it's something else when you have military members, when you have those who were from his own administration, when you have someone like Dick Cheney. I keep reminding folks, we as Democrats used to call Dick Cheney Darth Vader for a reason.
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay, this is the only man that can get away with shooting his friend in the face, and so
it is amazing to see how many Republicans have said, "Hey, I'm putting country before party," and are making that move. What is equally surprising, though, well, surprising is maybe the wrong word, but to see so many people seem to be willingly blind, that are just going to turn the other cheek, and especially the conservative Christians, to say, to find a reason why this man somehow represents their interests. I'm astounded.
Well, I'm like I said, I am a man of faith, but I look at evangelicals with a side eye nowadays, because you can't convince me that you're for Trump because of his stance on abortion, but yet you turn a blind eye to all the other horrible, horrendous things. If any one of us were forming a company and we were looking for a CEO, would you hire someone with 34 felonies?
Exactly.
And they include bribery. They include sexual assault. They include fraud. I mean, will we hire someone to run our company with that kind of rap sheet, that kind of resume? I think not. And so you're highlighting the point about how celebrities are coming forward. But again, in a matter of 107 days, so much has been revealed. And we now know how to move forward, because there are a lot of folks that I had to unfriend on my social media because I didn't know what spots or stripes they were carrying, but now I do.
Representative Jackson, there's there are two questions here. One my daughter just sent me, but and I'll get to that in a moment. One of the things that, looking forward with my after the election eye, one of the things that the Republican Party does, that they excel at compared with the Democratic Party, is they do a marvelous job of playing the long game. Roe versus Wade, we're going back 50 years of fighting, and they dug in their heels. They fell back sometimes. They moved forward a little. They fell back a little bit. They moved forward a little bit. But it's the long game. Always eye on the ball. Republicans do two things very well. One is using power while they have it, regardless of what the outcome is going to be. And I think the electorate gives them a little bit of a pass on that as well. But they play the long game. They say, we'll take some losses here, but we're always keeping our eye on the ball. My concern with the coalitions that exist right now and all the endorsements and all the Republicans, we're making so much of the Republicans that are coming on board. And yes, necessary for the time. I'm already looking 4 years ahead. And you know, if Kamala Harris, VP Harris, if she's elected in this cycle, which we believe that she will be, she still has to get to the next 4 years after that. Because here's what's going to happen. Alito and Thomas are just going to sit back in their seats now, because now they're not going anywhere. Because now there's not a Republican to replace them. So they'll sit down another 4 years and wait until they can get relieved. We can't have this same conversation 4 years from now, fighting with our own folks, trying to convince them to get her back in. That's long game. What are your thoughts about long game?
I absolutely agree with you. We as Democrats, we need to do a better job with our, I call it our political vision, being able to look 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road and say, what kind of America do we want year 2050, 2060, and start reverse engineer that and start implementing those steps in 2024. But I will also say we got to do two other critical steps. One step we need to do is bring back the education of Schoolhouse Rock. And I don't say that to demean anybody's intelligence, but when you have a very informed electorate, when people understand how this how politics and policy impacts their life, they would tend to want to vote if you understand how politics impacts their life, how it influenced their life. And so we all grew up with Schoolhouse Rock. We all grew up with a understanding of being critical thinkers and creative thinkers and problem solvers. Those three elements are absent in our curriculum today. And so we got to start there. We got to have a more informed, educated electorate. So that way they will understand how policies and laws and legislation and bills, how it works and how it impacts their life. The second step.
And one of our viewers agrees with you on that, says that that's one of the Weekend Bohemian says says that you're spot on right
And I
there,
think,
bringing in some of our listeners and watchers.
and I think our second step is this, brother. I think Republicans can't beat Democrats on policy. If we were voting purely on policy, we'll beat them all the time. But we don't do a very good job marketing and telling our story about the policies that we bring forward. And so what I have done, now I'm going into my 5th term, I start reminding my constituents that Democrats created Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Medicaid, Medicare, Affordable Care Act, Social Security. These are hallmark pieces of legislation. And when you start to tell that story on how we always look at from cradle to career to your grave, the Republicans never could beat us when it comes to hallmark legislation.
But there's also I was gonna say this, but there's also the messaging and their ability to, I'll tell you what Donald Trump's biggest success was, and Dr. Leon Wilmer, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this as well in conversation with Representative Jackson. Within the Black community, particularly among Black men, what was Donald Trump's one big score while he was in office? The stimulus. His signature, that big fat Sharpie on there. And that's something that Democrats won't do.
Well, you're not talking about the Sharpie.
And Biden had one of.
You're not talking about the Sharpie on the hurricane map.
No. We're talking about the one on that $1,200 check.
But Jonathan, that also goes to your long game versus short game, because as they would say on the corner, that's short money right there. That stimulus check, that was short money. That wasn't long money. But we are so focused on the short money that that we don't even really understand what long game means. And let me add one more thing about
we've got to read
about the abortion issue. And Representative Jackson, I'm sure you got a crowd forming, but what you have with the abortion issue is the merger of religion and politics. You go back to Frank Schaeffer, who was the reverend back in the 70s when Roe was passed by the Supreme Court. He was the Christian pastor that said, we now have to merge our religion with our politics. And that's how you got Jerry Falwell in the Christian Coalition. That's how you got Ralph Reed in the Moral Majority. They thought Ronald Reagan was going to be the president to put that constitutional provision in place. He played them cheap. Then they thought George W. was going to do it, and he played them cheap. So it's not so much that that you ask yourself, how can they be pro-abortion and then be for Trump? Because they, in that regard, are single voter. They're single issue voters, and as long as they get that abortion issue, all the other stuff is irrelevant.
Doc. Yeah, no, I just want to add.
Hold your thought for a second, Representative. We're going to go to the map and just take a quick look at developments that are taking place as we speak.
Can you stay with us? Do you have a problem staying with us?
I got about 5 more minutes. I got to go to Politico. They just sent me a text that they've been delayed, so that's the reason why I'm able. Because I had a 9 o'clock with Politico, but they told me they're delayed. So we got about it looks like about 10 to 15 more minutes, Doc.
Well, stick with us. We're just taking a look at the map as we speak. It looks like Donald Trump's got about 120 electorals to Kamala's 99. But again, it's very early in the evening, and we can see those come from places that we expected they would come from, much in the Midwest and the Deep South. Of course, Georgia's not weighed in yet. North Carolina. So there's some big states that still have to weigh in, but that's the status of things as we speak. So back to our conversation. Representative, I want to change lanes real quick and talk about another element of the electorate. There's the sleeping giant, which I refer to as the Latino vote in America. And that group of the electorate has grown exponentially over the last decade. I wonder, is that something that when you're plotting out your strategy as a politician and you're looking at your constituencies, does that play a higher priority with you? Do you think about that when you're doing the things that you do?
That's a great question. So it all depends which state you're looking at. So, for example, here in Georgia, our base starts with Black women, then Black men. And so Georgia has 2.7 million Black registered voters. On average, we might get about 1 million to come out and vote. And so our goal is to reduce that gap. If we can get closer to 2 million to come out and vote, you'll have a Black governor in Georgia. You have a Black lieutenant governor in Georgia. You'll have a lot of, state constitutional offices. And so our goal will differ greatly if we were in Florida. In Florida, you have to look at the Latino Hispanic population, especially when you get south of Orlando. Mm-hmm. So it really depends from state to state. We do have a strategy, a get out the vote strategy, and it's really tailored to that state. Like, for example, in Pennsylvania, it was really to get out the Black vote and the Latino vote. Michigan, you have Asian, you have Indian, Black, white suburban. And so every state has its own strategy in terms of how we have our ground game operations, our get out the vote. And going back to your map, we on the campaign call this later on this afternoon, we already knew that the blue wall, we've been calling it, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, we're not going to see those numbers until tomorrow. It's just the way it is, the way these laws are set up from state to state. But our internal polling, she's up in Pennsylvania like 60-40. In Michigan, she was up by 20 points. And in Wisconsin, if my memory serves me correctly, she's up by 10 points. In Georgia, we're looking at she's up by 5 points. And so, of course, when you look at exit polling, our internal numbers, and so we're not worried. We're not. We're just waiting for the numbers to come in and tell us what we already know, that we're going to make history, and her name will be President Kamala Harris.
We also now have just been joined by Dr. Gerald Horne. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's early in the game, early in the night. Your thoughts on where we are and what signals are you receiving from what you're seeing at this point?
Well, one signal is coming out of Florida. I find it hard to believe that this pro-choice referendum went down to defeat, because we know that the Harris campaign spent a great deal of its campaign dollars directed at women, particularly rural American women. Admittedly, they were not necessarily spent in Florida, but it's obviously a damaging signal for anti-Trump forces that not only has Mr. Trump apparently prevailed in the Sunshine State, but that pro-choice referendum went down to defeat. As noted, the blue wall, those states have yet to be decided, have yet to be determined, but certainly it does not appear this early in the evening that this is going to be any sort of blowout election one way or another.
And we're also having join us right now Dr. Ronaldo Anderson, who's an associate professor of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. Dr. Anderson, welcome aboard.
Hey, good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
You're in Philadelphia, so you're at ground zero. That's where the campaign ended. Had its last stop last night. What are you seeing there on the ground?
Well,
how has it transformed over the past week?
I'll tell you what. 3 weeks ago, I don't know if they had it. But what happened here, because there was some legitimate concern about energizing black male voters. But after she came out and talked about the black male agenda, and then I think when Trump basically pissed off the Puerto Rican community, I think that's what kind of put her over the edge. Because one thing about when you're in cities, 3 weeks ago, you didn't really see that much energy on the street. But the last 10 days, when you start seeing the graffiti art, the pictures and stuff on subways, because I ride the trolleys and the subway every day going to work, that's when I could tell the mood kind of really focused in and locked in on the election. And when I got off work today, the lines at Temple University for voting were stretched around the block. Up here in North Philly, multiple locations. They're looking at now, they think they can surpass what Biden got out of Philadelphia 4 years ago. I know at Lehigh University, even out in the rural areas, because they put a lot of work into it, young people, long lines at all the university locations. That's why I think Trump posted on his social media, he started talking about corruption in Philadelphia and all that, because they know that if they have massive lines with young people and people of color in Pennsylvania, they're going to lose. Because the way they changed the laws recently, like 4 years ago, they counted the mail-in ballots were counted after the in-person voting. But today they released the numbers. So she has like a couple 100,000 vote lead. And I would suspect sometime in the next few hours, after all those rural areas where he has to run up the numbers after that drive out, Philadelphia is going to still be cranking out votes. So the three parts of Pennsylvania that are going to, I think the whoever wins Northeast Pennsylvania is going to win, because Harris is going to carry Pittsburgh area and Philadelphia. And so they're looking at a couple of the surrounding suburbs, but they're going to be looking up around Lackawanna County and Scranton, and then what they get out of the those Northeast areas that, some of those people don't realize. A lot of those Puerto Rican Americans that live there, they're, a lot of them work or they're from New York, And so right now, I'd say I think you won't wait until tomorrow for Pennsylvania to be called, because the mail-in ballots are being announced even as we speak. They're tabulating them.
Dr. Horn, being in Texas,
yes,
and looking at the Ted Cruz race, and to Dr. Anderson's point about Donald Trump pissing off Latinos, Puerto Ricans, and then Latinos across the board. In Texas, are you seeing any reverberations of that?
I would like to say yes, but I'm afraid that I'm going to have to say no. You may recall that approximately 6 years ago, Ted Cruz was up against Beto O'Rourke. Mm-hmm. The Democrats considered it a moral victory of sorts when Beto O'Rourke only lost by 220,000 votes. This year, Mr. Cruz is up against Colin Allred, a Black American, a former pro football player, a civil rights lawyer. He has been running neck and neck in the polls. However, he may be accused justifiably of making certain blunders. For example, until Beyonce and Willie Nelson showed up in Houston for a major rally a few days ago, he had been shunning the Harris campaign. Now, I understand that because this is the reddest of the red states, so to speak. But at the same time, I'm not sure if he's trying to defeat Ted Cruz, if it's smart to stand aside from your presidential nominee. Now, with regard to the Latino vote, it's heavily encrusted alongst the border with Mexico, and some of those cities, McAllen, Brownsville, etc. You have 90+% Mexican American, and there hangs a tail because, of course, there's no necessary overlap between Puerto Ricans in the Northeast being irked because their island is called an island of garbage, and people of Mexican origin alongst the border are that resonating with them. And Mr. Cruz has made major overtures to those border communities. Mr. Trump has done well in those border communities. The Republicans have done well in those border communities. So the bottom line is that I would not be surprised at all if Ted Cruz were to emerge victorious in his race for re-election. And it would not surprise me at all if Donald Trump wins the state of Texas.
Dr. Holm, I want to jump on something you just said. We've got an interview we did during the RNC with a young lady who was with a group, I believe it was called Hispanics for Trump. But take a listen to what she had to say. I think we've got that tape. You guys can hear it.
No, we can't hear it yet.
Well, once we get that up, here we go. Here we go.
At politicsandcolor.com. We are here live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the Republican National Convention. Bianca Gracia is my guest. Latinos for Trump is the organization. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And why are Latinos for Trump?
So I'm actually one of the co-founders of Latinos for Trump since 2016, when it was not popular to talk about Trump, follow Trump. And so we had a national movement that started actually from the West Coast, and we spread all the way to the East Coast. And I'm kind of out in the middle. I'm from Texas. And so we just united back in 2016 and started chapters all over different states, and we've been going strong. And even right now, from 2020, since he's not been in the White House, we have Latinos for America First now. So we kind of been, I run both of the organizations.
So those watching this and listening to this conversation, I'm sure there are many who would want me to ask, when you go to the first campaign, the 2016 campaign, and all of the rhetoric about Mexicans are thieves, they're coming across the border, they're raping your children, they're bringing drugs, and that whole racist diatribe, how many would want to know then, how can an organization support that kind of rhetoric?
Well, we were called all kinds of names for that, because how dare we, not fall in line with the Democrat Party and not spew the ad, and we're supposed to defend our people. But look, Donald Trump said exactly what was happening. So I am close to a border town. I grew up close to a border town. I know exactly what's happening. I know that there were bad hombres that were coming across. Now, back in 2016, remember, he was not politically savvy. He's a businessman. So he said things that offended people, obviously. I called it ripping band-aids. It's like, people even in the barrio, if I talk to somebody, be like, oh, we don't like that man. I'm like, really? But come on, let's be real here. There's gangsters up and down your street, people selling crack. You got prostitutes walking up and down your street, gang shootings. I mean, whatever, come on, let's talk. They're like, well, that's true. Okay, well, what's the problem? Okay, so I think in 2016, it was everybody knew the elephant in the room, but nobody really wanted to talk about it. And as he started to rip those band-aids.
And what's the elephant?
That there was illegal the illegals that were bad that were coming across the border, and we needed to build a wall. We need to secure our border, and that people want to come here. They need to come here legally. So that was the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about.
Building the wall.
Yes.
That's a common. Again, in fact, both Trump and Biden are both on that mission. But,
Biden's not on that mission.
Well, it hasn't the Biden administration provided funding for the continuing building of the wall? No, that's not going on now.
No.
Oh, okay.
No, it is not. In fact, the Democrat Party has told us over and over and over that there's nothing wrong with the border, that it is secure. I know different because I've actually done initiatives. I work with Border Patrol agents. And since 2019, actually, our organization fed Border Patrol agents for appreciation of doing their job, trying to do their job, from Brownsville all the way to New Mexico. Okay, so we would go and feed them. Now, that's one thing. Now, I just did an initiative last year, and September 11th, and we're going to do it again this year. We went and picked up trash on the border, 20,000 tons, 20,000 tons. And I have pictures of this video of just clothes, bottles, Pampers, disgusting. I'm not even going to say needles, syringe. I mean, you name it. It was just pounded into the ground that we needed to get the little bobcats to even like dig it up.
Right.
20,000 tons of trash in a half a mile radius. And so we worked with a Border Patrol chief, Gloria Chavez, and she's like, you have no idea, just this little section that you all have cleaned up. The Border Patrol agents are just so thankful that you came and did it. And here's the thing, she said, but the whole border, 2,000 miles of it is just like this. And I said, what? Are you kidding me? Now, here's an interesting thing. There is a college, UTRGV, right on Brownsville, that sits on the border. This is their backyard. So there was a professor, and she offered extra credit for kids to come out. And, there's social justice warriors and believe in the environment to come help out, to come help out and do, the cleanup. In exchange, they had to, write, in order to get their extra credit, they had to write a report.
Right.
She sent me the essays. Now, these kids were like, oh, open border, they supported that poor people were coming over because they just were looking for work. When they saw this, they had to roll up their sleeves and clean up the mess that was in their backyard that they had no idea was there.
Okay.
And when they did that, they wrote in their essays, and she sent them to me. She says, I think this is important, and they want me to help them publish them. But the kids changed their mind about an open border, and the kids said the United States must secure the border, and the United States now must enforce the laws that are in the books. Because we've asked Border Patrol, what can we do to really help with, we understand building the wall, we understand all that. What can we do? And you know what they said? They said, honestly, how do we clean this mess up? Is enforcing the laws that already exist. But the current administration does not let them enforce the laws.
I don't know what to make of that, gentlemen. She obviously is very close to the situation, but is very micro. Has got a micro vision on what she's talking about. At least that's what I get from it. But I want to ask all of you scholars on a much larger plane here. Are we in a position where we have to create a better allegiance with our brown brothers and sisters? Because we are looking ahead at an electorate that is growing way faster than ours, or way faster than our community. And I'm wondering if we're missing an opportunity to make a critical allegiance, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, let me just quickly say, I don't think that we as African Americans have a firm enough grip on our own agenda to be able to form alliances with other entities. It's very hard to coalesce out of weakness you need to be, to me, you need to be able to coalesce out of strength. And we have yet to develop that for our own agenda. Once we understand that, then I would say we can look to find commonality with other entities.
Well, here's my thinking on it, and you guys can weigh in. You know, we see Black folk weighing in on Ukraine and things that are going on in other parts of the world, North Korea, but I don't hear a lot of that stuff, a lot of that passion about what needs to be happening here when our communities and the brown communities have some very similar issues. If we talk about, police abuse, I mean, we're in that same boat. They're in the same boat as we are. We're talking about access to resources, financial resources, the lack of banks and markets in our communities. We're in the same boat. And it seems to me we have enough similar issues that we ought to be doing some things together.
I don't think I talked to this. I told Jonathan on a show he was hosting. I'm just looking at some of the data I saw from the 2020 census, and then what Dr. Horn said was correct. You have two broad, separate views in the Black community. Those are the inner city, and those are the suburbs. And that's why some of the fracturing started showing up. And when they were trying to get, when they talked about Blacks drifting from the Democratic Party. And it's been slowly kind of drifting that way really since the 2008 election of Obama. That's when it was at its peak in terms of, I remember in St. Louis at that time, participating in the election, you saw people from Africa, all different walks of life. It almost felt like a Pan-African thing at the grassroots level for Obama. But like I have friends and I've written about, like I turned away. I mean, I kept voting, but a lot of people who would think of themselves as kind of, whether they're progressive nationalists or Pan-Africanists or so forth, turned their back on that part of the Black community after the destruction of Libya by the Obama administration. And then I think as one of the people that participated in Ferguson, when they talked about the tension between working class or poor Black men and college educated people that assumed, quote unquote, the voices of the movement. So I think that's where, as Dr. Horn alluded to, if Harris wasn't running for president, but even when she wins, I think at the same time we are dealing with the external threat of MAGA, we might be talking about like a quiet civil war in the Black community. I think may erupt over the next few years. Something that I remember Harold Cruz talking about in the 60s, because if you are a nationalist or African American kind of nationalist person, basically Black liberals have been assumed the leadership of the mantle with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but we've had a lot of that stuff repealed. Civil rights gains have been repealed. I mean, Harris didn't even talk about trying to get affirmative action back. She just talks about opportunity economy. So I think there's going to be, for the first time in a couple generations, an ideological debate in the Black community in terms of this kind of multipolar thing that I see going on. I'd be more interested to see if we could work with the Asian American community than the Latinos, because they got more money and they're better educated. Because a lot of the Latino community, which I saw in that interview, that was a hostility of Mexicans towards Central Americans. They're not the same people. And so, and then as when I was doing some work in Colombia last year, the way the Afro-Colombians explained it to us, they said, our struggle is similar to you all. You all just got to fight the Pilgrims. We down here fighting the conquistadors. And there's a significant portion of the Hispanic community that identifies as white, and they want those Anglo privileges. And we ain't going to be able, there's a new book out called The Rise of the Latino Right. And in parts of Latin America, the Latino right, they're more race. You know, you can work with a white liberal before you can one of the right wing Latinos. So I think, and plus the Asians vote more progressive than the Hispanics anyway. So I think that's this where we better look at. The chessboard is getting ready to really look different here in the next few years. And I don't think that the usual civil rights rhetoric that they've used in the past is going to be enough to bring us together.
Dr. Horn?
Well, first of all, we have to disaggregate, obviously, what's called the Latino community. I mean, set to one side the Cuban American community concentrated in Florida, those who came over after the Cuban Revolution of 1959. They tend to lean towards the right wing. If you look at the Venezuelan American community and the Nicaraguan American community, they too have fled what they consider to be leftist regimes in Managua and Caracas. They oftentimes lean to the right. And if you look at that article in the Wall Street Journal just from the last few days, many of the Venezuelan Americans who arrived on planes, they tend to disdain those of Venezuelan origin who crossed the border on foot. On the other hand, if you look at the Puerto Rican community and the Dominican community in the Northeast, they tend to be more compatible with the Black community, perhaps because there are significant percentages of both communities that have peoples of African descent. And then with regard to the largest component of the Latino community, which is the community of Mexican ancestry, I think it's very revealing, because if you look at the Chicano community of Southern California, they tend to be more compatible with the Black community, although of course there are contradictions, than the Mexican American community of the state of Texas. And I think that reflects the fact that California is a blue state and Texas is a red state. Mm-hmm. And that conservatism, as your interview tended to suggest, that conservatism tends to infect many, particularly alongst the U.S.-Mexico border. But I concur with Professor Anderson, who suggests that we really need an ideological debate in the Black community in terms of how this present constellation of forces was constructed. If you take the broad view of what's happened in this country over the past 75 years, you see that many on the left were systematically purged in the early 1950s, starting with the late, great Paul Robeson. Then the 1960s, the Black Panther Party was bludgeoned into submission. I'm afraid to say that those left standing, including some of our friends on the NAACP, they stood alongside those particular purges, and therefore they are standing to this very day, but without many folks recognizing as to how that process took place. The fact that as we speak, we cannot say definitively that a man facing prison, unless he's returned to the White House, has a chance of prevailing, that should be the cause for ringing the alarm bells. It's a 5-alarm fire. If we keep doing what we have been doing and expect radical, progressive, liberal results when they don't seem to be in the offing, well, what does that say about us? That says perhaps that we are not necessarily being responsive to the cries of our besieged community. So certainly better late than never, however, in terms of having this sort of debate that Professor Anderson has addressed.
And just really quickly, Brian, you and I were talking earlier today about the Latino community. I was making the point about those that have been able to acquire citizenship and those that have not. And that there is a sense of disdain by many who have acquired citizenship, looking down upon those who have not, because many who have acquired citizenship believe that that is going to be a protection for them against the racism that is being spewed by the MAGA crew. Professor
It's
Anderson,
interesting. I hear from all of you that for us, the glass is half empty, that we can't look to allies and we don't have enough collective adhesion amongst ourselves. I don't know, that doesn't bode well from what you guys are telling me. Does the prospect of a Harris presidency kind of put a little water back in that glass?
Well, let me just describe it this way. If we're talking about allies and we put it in a military context, if I walk to the door and I say, hey, let's get down, and they turn to me and say, well, where's your army? And I turn around and say, well, it's me, it's Jonathan Clark, Brian Jenkins, Dr. Horn, and Dr. Anderson. They go, well, call us when you get a crew. I mean, you know, we don't have an army, gentlemen.
Well, I think also we need to recognize that in this mostly conservative country, that the Black community is a kind of an outlier. And with regard to being an outlier, that's why we are oftentimes stunned, if not befuddled, by the kind of conservatism that we just were made witness to with regard to this Latinos for Trump woman. And I think that also helps to explain why we're always looking abroad for allies. I mean, after all, what other community votes 8-2 or 9-1 against the right wing? The Latinos, generally speaking, at best, vote 6-4 against the right wing. Of course, under George W. Bush, those numbers were flipped. Donald J. Trump has sought to flip those numbers further. And so we have a choice. Either we can adapt to the rising conservatism, which obviously is a non-starter because the rising conservatism has us in the crosshairs. And that would be as if the turkey were endorsing Thanksgiving. Or we can begin to have the kind of ideological debate that Professor Anderson has spoken to, and also begin to engage in an agonizing reappraisal of how we got to this perilous moment, whereas of 9:40 p.m. on election night in the United States of America, we may be facing the prospect of a felon returning to the White House in January 2025. I cannot think of anything more disastrous.
Professor Anderson?
Well, one of the things I'm looking at, and I concur with Dr. Horn's assessment, I think just looking at the Black community, we're only together right now to stop Trump. It doesn't necessarily mean that this entire Black community is there to help her govern. Because I think when you look at her policy and who she had speak for her, like I said, at terms, she almost, you just changed she reminded me a little bit of like Mitt Romney. I mean, she had, it's just, she, I believe, is the only reason you got Liz Cheney campaigning with Kamala Harris is that the Council of Foreign Relations types are terrified of the MAGA crowd. And so there's going to be a temporary alliance between the Black liberals, Council of Foreign Relations types, Wall Street types to stop the MAGA anti-internationalist crowd.
Any port in a storm.
And
The
so
enemy of my enemy is my friend.
yeah, and it's only going to be temporary. That's why all this kumbaya after. No, you have to almost look at it like they kept talking about the Civil War. Well, the Civil War, the Southern plantocracy was defeated by an alliance of abolitionists and Northern white business interests, and then they had the intelligence to freed enslaved Africans that gave them an extra 250,000 of troops to overwhelm the South. And so this is similar to that, where you have a temporary alliance of elite elements in this country to stop the MAGA movement of white nationalist authoritarianism for seizing power. And after the election is over with, I'm thinking, because I was looking at something I saw David Lammy say in the United Kingdom, I'm forecasting that Kamala Harris is going to probably try to, and I'm reading more on it, this concept called progressive realism, woke is not making a comeback, wokeism or whatever, because the American polity is going to have too many constraints on it. They got to deal with $36 million of debt, a possibility of World War III. So her challenges are even more significant than what Obama was when he got in office. And her tools that she has to deal with the crisis are not even as good as what Obama had. So she's going to have to make some hard choices. She's probably hoping, even if she wins, if they can defend the Senate and get the House, and Hakeem Jeffries is the Speaker of the House, she's going to have to probably get rid of the Senate filibuster, and then in about the first 12 to 18 months, get everything she wants to try and put bandages or whatever that they got to do. Because after the midterm elections, they're going to probably lose some seats. And like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if Kamala Harris would not be reelected, because most people said, I haven't forgot what Nikki Haley said. Nikki Haley said the first party that gets rid of the 80-year-old white dude is going to win. and the Democrats got rid of their 80-year-old white dude first. And if it had been any other generic Republican, they'd already forecasted the generic Republican would have just won by a landslide this rip. So I think Harris it's going to be a very difficult time for the governing aspect, and even, but there's a lot of politicians too. Their first job when they win is to get reelected. So I wouldn't be surprised if even on immigration, she goes on and passes the Langford sponsored bill that came out of the sentence. To me, that would be intelligent, because a lot of my black liberal friends don't like admitting there were a lot of inner city blacks that were pissed off with illegal immigration. And I heard it here in Philadelphia a lot. And you could hear up in the North, hey, I know the black Southerners determine the primaries, but the black North determines the outcome of elections. And they want to see something done on immigration. So I don't see her as I think she's going to have some type of a blend of progressive realism and it's going to piss off some of the so-called, left-wing proud progressives that still, in the system. But yeah, man, even if she wins, she's not going to have the honeymoon that even Obama had.
Well, here's a couple of little positives, perhaps, for her. We're hearing that the U.S. Senate may add 2 females. Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware, she's got 64% of the vote so far, and Angela also Brooks from Maryland, who's got 55% of the vote. So we'll see how that turns out. In the meantime, a lot of states. We're going to take a quick look at the map, gentlemen.
Let me before we go there, if I could ask, or while we're going there, let me ask Dr. Horn a question on Professor Anderson's point about governance, because Dr. Horn, to Professor Anderson's point, yeah, we've been the black community has been rallying around Professor Harris to defeat Donald Trump, and when you then start asking, well, what's the policy? What policy is she proposing? What does the community get for its support? All you hear are either crickets or people telling you that doesn't matter. Have you been getting that same sense? And if you don't demand anything, you won't get anything.
Well, certainly we need to make demands. And we need to make demands because I'm afraid to say that if Kamala Harris is able to pull the rabbit out of the hat, she will not only owe a debt of gratitude to the black constituency, she'll owe a debt of gratitude perhaps to Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, Robert Kagan, the neocon hawk from the Washington Post editorial pages, who is married to Victoria Nuland, the architect of the Ukraine escapade. And the constituency that they represent are not prone to accept empty promises or rhetoric. And there's going to be a conflict within the Harris constituency between those forces who are going to be demanding an escalation of military spending, and our community, which demands, I would imagine, that tax dollars be directed instead towards healthcare and education. To that end, in the Wall Street Journal just this morning, there was a striking article about what was called, what the investor class is looking at And of course, many of them are placing a bet on prison stocks because they expect Mr. Trump to prevail. And you can imagine who will be victimized if the prison industrial complex has more money to play with, not only the Black American community, but keep in mind that Mr. Trump has promised to engage in the most significant mass deportation in the history of the United States that'll probably mean the erosion, if not overthrow, of the temporary protective status that now keeps 300,000 plus Haitians in this United States of America. We all know about the vicious rhetoric that he's directed against our Haitian brothers and sisters with regard to their presidential debate and the unfortunate comments that I will not necessarily repeat. So, irrespective of who prevails, and I'm looking at this map and it shows that Mr. Trump is now at 178 of the 270 electoral votes that are needed. Whoever prevails, it's going to be an uphill climb, I'm afraid to say.
It looks like now we can bring in, are we going to bring in Professor Lucene? Is he there? There we go. There we go. And Dr. Chantella Sherman. So we've got a historian, journalist, and author of In Search of Purity, Eugenics and Racial Uplift Among New Negroes, 1915 to 1935. Also, Popular Eugenics in Television and Film. Dr. Chantella Sherman, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by a professor of political science at Howard University and the author of the newly released $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice and Democracy, Dr. Clarence Lucene. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Hello, everybody.
So,
good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask Dr. Sherman, since you're the first female on the panel, thanks for joining us. I wanted to get your perspective on this, less from a political standpoint and just from the female perspective. I mean, I'm sure that, we looked at this when Hillary was making her run and saw one facet of this, but from a Black woman's perspective, this has to be something different.
It's completely different. And I just think in historical terms as a whole, when we think in terms of race, we think in terms of men. When we think in terms of gender, we think in terms of white women. And so when you think in terms of African-American women, women of color as a whole, but specifically Black women, you're introducing into the conversation the antithesis of what it is, eugenically speaking, of what it is to be a citizen, of what it is to be powerful, of what it is to be fit, in terms of just simply being qualified. So it's an uphill battle in a different type of way for a Black female, because what you're looking at intrinsically is someone who's going against the grain of Americanism. And so I thought that it was a long shot. Dr. Leon and I have talked in the past about the politics of popularity and just understanding that saying that a Black woman has entered the frame brings up anxiety for men, for Black men, for white women. And then in an international space, we always say that all elections are local, unless you're talking about the presidency. And then quite frankly, it is global. And so you have to understand also by adding that global space into this, that you're talking about cultures around the world who have particular disdain for Black women. And so all of these other things, these nuances enter into the frame. And so it's not just about who's qualified anymore. It's about the fact that a woman is in this space and a Black woman is in this space. So fortunately or unfortunately, these are some of the things that we have to deal with that we don't necessarily talk about. And once we get into an international space like this, it becomes extremely complicated. So when you see a Donald Trump up against someone who is uniquely qualified for the position, but is not necessarily getting the votes, you have to ask yourself why. And it makes all of us have to look a little closer at some of, again, the eugenic spaces minds are in, as opposed to the things in the rhetoric that we say.
Well, I think for all of us that probably came to mind when the unions didn't give their endorsement, as they usually do to most Democratic hopefuls. But I think it was fairly obvious at that point what was going on. You know, I think we've got. Let me take a break in my thought here. I think Dara is going to join us again. Yes, there she is, Dara Kennedy. Dara, what's going on? I think your mic is off. There's our correspondent on the scene there at Howard, and she's talking to folks, getting some viewpoints on what's going on. A lot of students out there, which is good. Young folks motivated to get out and get involved.
There we go, guys.
All right.
All right, you can hear me there. Sorry, it's just so loud here. So even though there's no music playing, I think we're all watching the projections right now and seeing how the vice president is doing in Pennsylvania. Are we watching that on your end as well?
Yes, we are.
So the crowd here kind of erupted when that happened. But before we got to the before they started doing the projections, I bumped into Mr. Gary Hunter, who you guys may know is a White House correspondent, photographer for over 3 decades. He's photographed almost every single president for the last 30 years. I brought him in because he's been on the campaign trail, just like Politics in Color has, and he feels a certain way about what this is tonight. I'm gonna give you that so you can hear their conversation and also talk.
Well, let's be honest. A lot of us.
Gary Hunter, everybody.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
When you talk about this moment right here that we're in, and I know it feels like a party because we're on Howard's campus, but the bigger picture is it's possible that we may see our second Black president ever. And you've been photographing these people, Congressional Black Congress and others, for over 3 decades. What makes this so special?
Well, it's another answered prayer. It's another grandmama's call. It's another grandfather's call. It's another uncles and aunties. It's all those moments. It's all those moments that we've suffered. We've been maids. We've been butlers. We've been shoe shine men, and yet we always said, and there's always been a prayer that we will be presidents, we will be congressmen, we will be senators, and all of those prayers are being answered tonight. But not only have they been answered, I pray to God that the answered prayer of Hakeem Jeffries being the Speaker of the House, as much as we know there's been a struggle the last 5 to 6 months to get the Black vote to be participating. We're disappointed, but yet we must keep hope. We're disappointed, but we must keep the focus. We're disappointed, but we must stay on the straight and narrow. We must keep focusing on winning for our daughters, winning for our sons. Yes, we mad, we upset. We have not gotten what we feel we deserve for all the votes that we've given. We've given up neighborhoods, we've given up communities and counties and states, and yet we seem to be in the same damn struggle. Preachers have given up their churches. They've been challenged, they've been threatened, and yet we in the same position in a lot of spaces. Yes, we've heard the promises.
So let me ask you this. As you're on the campaign trail, the last few weeks have been very contentious with the Black male vote. You were in Detroit with the vice president. You were with President Barack Obama. You've traveled around in Georgia where the Black male vote is very important. What did you learn from the brothers on the ground?
They don't feel heard. They don't feel listened to. My discrepancy is, I know President Obama, I know Miss Obama, I know Doug, the second gentleman, I know the vice president. So I struggle with knowing these lovely people, but not being able to get the Democratic Party to really respect the fact that you got voters that love the candidates but we are not in love with the party that has neglected us to a full extent.
And by party, he's talking about the Democrats.
The
So
Democrats.
as we were talking about in our pre-meeting, Brian and Wilmer, these are the kind of issues that have been going on the ground when we start talking about how do you bring in some of the black vote. We'll also get to the Latino vote in a minute, but I wanted Pastor Hunter here to just talk about his experience being on the ground and covering these presidents. He hears the plight of the people on the ground. So while we're still very excited, we want to be hopeful that, like he said, some of those voices that the Democratic Party has tried to reach and touch, hopefully they've been touched. Hopefully it shows tonight. So that's what we hope for. Sorry, guys, and I know you were having a conversation, but I wanted to bring him in just to touch.
I wish that we would understand. I wish we would understand the plight of not only Black America, but woman America. Woman America, son America, daughter America, auntie America, uncle America. What do we do with the Black, brown, and the Hispanic? Why do we allow them to divide us? We are not divided. We're all forced immigrants, one way or another. And I don't know where we get this fight, where we think we need to be against one or the other. I don't know where we get this struggle.
So with that being said, it's reckoning tonight, Brian, Jonathan, Wilmer, all of the guests that are watching. This is the moment where all of this passion that you see from someone that's been out here covering the Democratic and the Republican Party for the last 30 years, it's built up, right? And so it's time for something else to give. And I think that's the passion that we're hearing. And even with the young kids over here behind us, they're very excited. They're a little anxious, but they're very excited. They haven't had 30 years of experience, but they understand the division that's happening in the country right now, and no one wants it. So thank you.
I thank God for the excitement, but the work really starts tomorrow, no matter who's winning. The work starts tomorrow. All these Black men groups and new Black men groups coming up. When I spoke to 12 mayors in Pennsylvania, we all met in Aliquippa with Mayor Walker. When I spoke to the few mayors in Illinois, including Mayor Johnson, who's doing an awesome job, and Mayor.
And what was the conversation? Because I got to wrap up, so they can go back.
Okay,
I mean, what was the conversation with the Black mayors?
The conversation is they don't feel included just like the rest of us do, and they were a little bit neglected as well. At the end, a couple of them sent me pictures saying, okay, they did come by, but the real bottom line is, who are these people that are able to give money or transfer money and get attention, but you don't respect the everyday voter? If my vote counts, give me the same respect that you give somebody with a pocket.
And that seems to be some of the historical issues with the Democratic Party.
Well, we hear the frustration and the equal excitement going on all around you. So I guess we're in waiting mode.
Our 30-year veteran is a little frustrated, and then the sophomores are very excited.
Yeah. Well, that's across the board.
And then Cardi B is playing.
We appreciate his input. I wanted to ask one of our guests, Clarence, to jump in here because we haven't had a chance to talk with him.
We'll quiet the music, but we're listening.
Thanks, Daryl. We'll get back to you. Clarence, you were listening to this. Let me ask you this question, and we haven't really covered this, but has the Democratic Party done a bait and switch with Black folks? I mean, we hear a lot about that.
Well, certainly the Democratic Party as a whole has not evidenced a progressive Black agenda. Let me put it like that. And so what we've seen has been what has always been the case, I argue, is that the Black community has made tactical decisions about who to support. Sometimes that's meant the Democratic Party, sometimes that's meant the Republican Party. So that's the consistency. It wasn't that Black people left the Republican Party, it was the Republican Party left Black people. And so what we see is that, again, an assessment is made at the community level, often articulated by elected officials, ministers, community activists, intellectuals that assess at any given moment what choice makes the most sense. And what that has meant in the post civil rights era, for many has meant the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean it was the ideal choice or the best choice, but the best choice available. And so I think that's what has been the articulation. And then at Howard University, it, I think, is a avatar for how the Black community at this moment is responding to the danger that's perceived by the far right, led by Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. We had an event down by Howard yesterday at Sankofa. Sankofa is a local Black bookstore where we went over these issues, and there were lots and lots of students there. And I was down by Howard today. And one of the things that's different from 2016 and even 2020, where we did a number of events, is that Black students are much more locked into defeating Trump. There's a lot of promote Harris, but it really is a lot of how do we stop Donald Trump, because they've looked at the positions of Project 2025. They've looked at the Trump administration. They've looked at the decisions of the Supreme Court with the three Trump appointees and the other conservatives. And so I think that, a very conscious, deliberate decision is being made, not necessarily to link the Black future to the Democratic Party, but to recognize the danger of this particular moment. And if I can speak for a second about Black men. So we have a polling group at Howard University. It's called the Howard Initiative on Public Opinion. And we've been doing polls for at least a year, looking and tracking Black voters. And our polls are different because we only focus on Black voters, where some of the other polls you're seeing kind of have a mix. And one of the things that we saw was that early in the year, it was absolutely evident that there were Black voters, particularly Black male voters, particularly younger Black male voters, who were trending towards Donald Trump. That dramatically changed after Biden stepped down and Harris stood up. And there's still, I think, a very good chance that Donald Trump will end up with single digits again in terms of the Black vote. In 2016, he won 6% of the Black vote. In 2020, he only won 8%, even though, again, they were saying that they were going to get double digits, 15, 20, 25%. In terms of Black males, Donald Trump actually did worse in 2020 than in 2016. In 2016, he won 14%. In 2020, he won 12%. One of the differences among Black male voters is, well, a couple of differences. One is generational. Older Black male voters have definitely more or less stayed and trended towards the Democratic Party. Any support that's driving towards the Republican Party tends to be under 30. But there's also regional differences. Black male voters in the South, for example, tend to be way more conservative than Black male voters either on the West Coast or outside of the South. So when you really dig into the numbers, you get very different kind of picture than I think what's generally been promoted.
Let me stop you for a second. I want to bring Jim Kavanaugh into the conversation. He's just joined us. He's with the Polemicist. Thanks for taking the time. Let me get your thoughts on where we are tonight.
Well, I've been watching the returns. It seems like it's generally following the same trajectory as 2020. Most of the counties and most of the states at this point, Kamala's doing as Biden did, and Trump is doing as Trump did. There's still not more than 50% of the vote in only a very few states. Georgia is the harbinger state where, again, it looks like everybody's following the same path they followed in 2020 so far. So I don't know what to make of it. From my point of view, I know Garland knows my position very well. I'm not a fan of either of these candidates. I hope they both lose. I'll be very happy to see Donald Trump disappear from American politics. And I have no hope at all for what will become of the United States under a Harris administration or a Trump administration. So I don't have a dog in the fight in that sense. And I'm a little surprised.
Well, Jim, you're American, so you do have a dog in the fight. You're American, and these are the choices that America has to choose from. Right?
Yeah,
so
I'm American.
When you say that there's doom, you don't understand what would happen under a Harris administration. We also know what could possibly happen under a Trump administration. So when you have two candidates that you say are doom and gloom, where does America go from here? If that's the case, right? If that's the sentiment for some people like you, we have to find the good in the options that we have. How do you move forward?
Or do you really have a problem with a black woman?
Excuse me? No, it's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer to it because I don't think there is a good answer to it. We're facing a situation. Look, there's a genocidal war going on, and the Biden-Harris administration is part of it, and the Trump administration will be part of it. This is the worst crime I've seen in the 20th century. There's nothing worse than this. Nothing. And we're watching children be shredded every day. Doctors and reporters and children. They're waiting till the doctors and reporters get home so they can kill their families. Now they're destroying the southern Lebanon. They're blowing up cities, not with bombs and from planes, but after everybody's gone, they wire up all the buildings to blow them up. This is what United States of America is doing. And when I see that neither of these people are going to stop that, each of them is going to continue doing this, I'm not very happy. And I don't have an answer to the question. I think, like with everything else, we have to organize politically, not dependent on parties and not attached to parties, for the issues that are important. We need to organize for healthcare. We need to organize for abortion rights, and we need to organize to stop wars and Zionist genocide, which the United States is completely committed to. So we have other choices. The other choices are to do other things, and there are other things, and that's really to organize politically, not as an adjunct of the Democratic Party or Republican Party, but independently put pressure on those parties, on whoever's going to do it, to actually change policies. And I'm not very happy about it. So I am doom and gloom in a certain way. And tell me why I should be. Tell me when the war against the Palestinians is going to end. And how it's going to happen. What we're going to do to Kamala or Donald that will end it.
Yeah, Vice President Harris. So what were the last candidates or the last administration where you felt comfortable? Because these aren't new problems. These problems didn't just start in the last 105 days, Mr. Jim. These problems have been going on with genocide forever. This didn't just start. So the question is, when did you last feel comfortable?
A long time ago. A long time ago. The last Democratic president I voted for was George McGovern. So, politics, I cannot get terribly enthusiastic about American party, Democratic or Republican duopoly politics. I think it's a trap in which we, the American people, and the world is trapped, and it's very dangerous, and it's getting worse. And no, there hasn't been a genocide like the one we're watching now. This is something that's different from anything I've seen in my life. Okay. There were terrible millions of people killed by Americans under Democratic and Republican administrations in Iraq, in Vietnam, etc. But what's happening here is a kind of genocidal violence where deliberate slaughter of children, deliberate slaughter of babies and of doctors and journalists and professors in order to ethnically cleanse the population. We're watching it.
No, and I'm hearing you, and I understand that, and I'm really appreciating your take on this, and this is an important conversation. As a woman who wasn't born when the last time for that last president that you voted for, what I know is that the people before me and my relatives, we had the civil rights movement. where people
Yeah.
were killed. And I'm not trying to, I'm not
Right here in
comparing
America.
days. Yeah, they were right here in
White
America.
people
Yeah.
been killing us for years, brother. I don't know where you come from, but
Yes,
in
we
the
have.
40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, I need you to go down to Montgomery, Alabama, and go to the Lynching Museum. I need you to be mindful that every day, we don't have to go to any foreign country to see where white people have killed blacks in America, killed Mexicans in America. Hell, they've even killed whites because they were with blacks. So I don't know what part of your blindness that you need to uncover your eyes with, but your history is messed up. Right here on American soil, they've killed millions of blacks.
And I think that conversation is one that many people especially are feeling in this moment since October 7th. As you said, people have felt like this is the worst that it's ever been, this war that's been going on.
We need to stop pacifying these white people who keep thinking that something new is happening. Y'all been killing us for years. I'm standing around white people now that don't want us in the space. I deal with this every day. Every time I turn around, I shouldn't have to call the White House to get a lot of stuff done, but I do.
So what you're saying is that you understand his position, but it's not a singular position, and I think. And this
I understand his sickness to not.
Well, let me jump in, Dara. Let me jump in here, but I don't want to get too far off on a tangent. But I understand we have a lot of single issues that motivate folks, and I understand Jim's point of view. But you know, to your guest there, Jim, I have to say, you know, we've been subject to genocide right here in America for the last couple of 100 years. So you know, I think while there's certainly sympathy toward the position there that you have regarding what's happening in the Middle East, you know, those of us who are here, who are still living this last part of I don't know, I would say judiciously, the last part of the genocide going on here, that we also have that to consider. So, and I guess my next question then would be to all of you, just a thought. While Kamala is certainly not a panacea for all of these things, is there in Kamala versus Trump some way that we can find a vessel in which we can all swim, if you get my drift?
Well, wait a minute, Jim. And Jim, this is Wilmer, not Garland.
Yeah.
But I understand. No. I get that. The fact that Africans in America and African Americans have been subjected to American genocide should make us even more sensitive, should make us even more outraged at the genocide that is playing itself out right before our very eyes with our tax dollars. This is not a matter of, and I don't have to speak for Jim. Jim is more than capable of speaking for himself. But this is not a matter of anybody being blind to anything. This is a matter of understanding where we are right now. And when a Democratic Party will not even allow at their convention victims of the genocide to speak at the convention, that to me speaks volumes. That speaks volumes. And again, our suffering and plight at the hands of this government should make us even more incensed. And when you look at I think it was Yahya Sinwar, who was just assassinated, when you saw the interview that he did a year and a half ago after his apartment building had been decimated, he had a picture of George Floyd in the corner of his apartment. They are more in line with us than we are with them. And we are the ones that are helping to pay for that genocide.
And if I might say, you know, and I'll raise the issue of Nelson Mandela again. Till the Palestinians are free, none of us are free. If I were faced with two political parties, both of which were committed to reinstituting slavery or reinstituting Jim Crow, I wouldn't have much enthusiasm for that either. You know, I have grown up in a situation, I've seen the changes that happened in American race relations, and because of the struggles of black people. And that's a good thing. And that's what had to happen. And I'm not posing my position in any way as unique or something that we have to think of in exclusion to that. But what I'm saying is, I feel exactly as if I were voting in 1956 for, one Jim Crow racist versus another Jim Crow racist. And there are other issues that might be important, but you might say in that situation, and I don't think it's crazy or anybody should be ridiculed for taking the position, that's a deal breaker for me. That's a deal breaker. So for me, the genocide that's happening now to the Palestinians is a deal breaker. And other things are important, but everybody has a deal breaker. And if there were two candidates, each of which just wanted to reinstitute Jim Crow, and one of them was pro-abortion and one of them wasn't, then that would still be a deal breaker.
Dr. Sherman, if you could talk about the eugenic language that we're hearing, particularly coming through the Trump campaign, but as I talked about when we were in London, there are acts of omission and acts of commission. The fact that Donald Trump is using racist tropes and eugenic language, but the fact that the other side sits idly by and either quietly allows it to be communicated or is complicit in the atrocity for as it relates to what's going on in Haiti, for example. Dr. Sherman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just jumping in here with the cheers because Vice President Harris is getting some of those red states
There we go.
right now. She's got Arizona is looking positive for her. In New Mexico. Those are states that we did not anticipate, quite frankly, especially with the history that she would be pulling so early in. And right now, that's why I muted, because the crowd just went crazy. And just before we go back to that conversation, the point is, if she can knock down and lock in those states right there, that's quite a clear path when you start locking in Arizona and the New Mexicos of the world, of the country.
Guys, can we take a look at the map while we're talking about this?
Yeah, let's go to the map. As some of these are about at 50. Some are about at 50% in. So let's look at that map. And then with Michigan, which is interesting as we talk about genocide and we talk about the war, of course, Michigan. Let's pull up the map there. Michigan is obviously such a key state. She was there, I think, 6 or 7 times. She may have been there more. I know she was in Pennsylvania 6 or 7 times, putting in a lot of work. And Jack, to your point, she was trying to ease over one black man, but also correct what Hillary Clinton did wrong in 2016. Additionally, she was talking about the war and how she wants to get this war complete. She wants to end it. She wants to get the hostages home. And with Detroit having the largest Arab population outside of the Middle East, it was very important for her to be there. So it's interesting that state right now is quite tied.
And she did meet with them, and she did, and I don't know how much one vice president can do that could change when she becomes president. And she has done everything she could to negotiate. I just happen to be privy to some of the conversations of, even when President Biden was negotiating, he would hang up on Nyati because he would just not listen. I'm the first to say that I think that we need to put more pressure on Nyati, but anybody that thinks that, especially those who want to attack President Harris, anybody who thinks that Trump with his son-in-law is going to allow anything.
That he would end the war.
Yeah, that he would end. That's just a joke.
Nobody said that. Nobody said that.
No, I didn't say. I mean, some people. Yes,
I certainly don't think that.
No, not you.
He wasn't saying on our show.
Not on your show. I'm from Michigan.
He's been on the campaign trail. And saying
in Michigan, that's what they were saying, and we know that's not true. But what I am saying is, it's important for us to understand the unity of all of us. We got to stop letting them teach us to hate each other. I don't hate the Arabics. I don't hate the Mexicans. I'm not mad of anybody getting anything. The lies about them getting free houses and all the rest of this stuff, it's easy to receive when you're hurting that somebody is getting a Band-Aid and you're mad because they got a Band-Aid. I don't want nobody bleeding. I don't want nobody outdoors. I don't want nobody homeless. But we do know that there's, and those of us who are on here are probably more educated to know this. I mean, I'm on Capitol Hill all the time. I'm the official photographer for the Black Caucus members. So I I yearn to see Hakeem Jeffries become the speaker who has a sensitivity about it because he's a Muslim. So a lot of this stuff, you got to remember, not just with the president, but it will curve when he becomes the speaker, if he becomes the speaker. And then you got Robin Kelly, who's going for vice chair.
Did we lose him? It sounds like we lost that signal. Well, let's get back to some other points that we were talking about earlier while we wait for Dara to come back to it.
And Dr. Sherman is back. And Dr. Sherman, did you understand my question? Not did you understand it? Was my question clear in terms of the eugenics language?
Yes, I believe so. I don't think that we've heard the scope of eugenics language, hereditarian thought, and language to this level probably in the last 100 years. And because we've not necessarily heard it, folks who are hearing it now just kind of take it, we ingest it without really paying much attention to it. When it's Donald Trump, he tends to speak in particularly eugenic language. It's about the racehorse theory. It's about genes. It's about genomics. It's about calling different people of different ethnic groups according to quote unquote race traits. And because we've lost a clear understanding as Americans, I think, of that language, it's not in front of us the way it once was. We tend to be offended by it, but not necessarily know how or understand the scope of it. It's loaded. It's loaded in ways where Donald Trump is speaking specifically to a group of people who still readily use eugenic theories. And so when you start talking about different groups of people who are naturally inclined to crime, when you start talking about immigrants in such a way where they're constantly a threat, when you start talking about women basically saying they need to be at home bringing forth life, they need to be nation builders again and out of the way of men and out of the way of the nation getting into trouble and causing conflict. What you've done is you've recast history in such a way where it's living and breathing, it's attached to us, and it's being revived in such a way where we're not really reacting the way we should. But it's going into these policies. So it's not the Supreme Court just suddenly deciding that Roe versus Wade needs to be overturned, or we're talking about IQ tests once again and entry into different universities and legacy appointments and things like that. These are conversations that were being had 100 years ago. They never stopped, but now they're back to the forefront. And the fact that we don't have a language to combat it, and therefore we don't have systems in place to challenge it readily, it makes the Trumps and those who support him, he is symptomatic of something larger. The fact that we don't have something in place to answer in kind is problematic in ways that we don't quite understand. We're looking at the global South in a global sense. We're talking about birth rates across the global South, and that will be a concern. So the idea that women need to be at home, Americans are not giving birth, is what the language is. Well, there are plenty of Americans who happen to not be white who are giving birth. This is the same language that's taking place, the same conversation that is taking place across the globe. These conversations are happening in England. They're happening across France. They're talking about birth rates. The leaders are talking about birth rates in decline, but it's not the birth rates in general that are in decline. It is who's having babies. That is the problem. And so if we don't, again, latch on to this in a way where it's not just reactionary, we're about to walk back into something, no matter who the president is. We're about to walk back into a space globally that is tragically familiar.
Folks, let me change lanes real quick. I'm seeing that NBC is projecting that Trump is going to win Iowa, which is interesting given the last little bit of polling we heard coming out of Iowa suggesting that Harris was leading. which leads me to this question about the lack of credibility of polling, period. They were talking to some expert about something called polling herding, which I had not heard about before, but maybe one of you can weigh in on what that means.
Dr. Lucene?
Yeah, so yeah, I saw the Iowa result. So I think there are a couple of things. One, polling is misleading because often people do not grasp the concept of margin of error. And so when you look at what came out a few days ago about Kamala Harris having a lead, this was within the margin of error. And as the social scientists on the panel here know, that means it could go in either direction. So the polling wasn't necessarily wrong. It just went outside the margin of error in the other direction, if that's what it turns out to be. So that's really critical. And much of the polling is snapshot polling as opposed to trend polling. So what we did at Howard, for example, with our polling center, is that we look at the same voters over a period of time. So that gives you a sense of a trend versus you look at some voters here in March, you look at different voters in April, you look at different voters in July, and then you draw some conclusions on those voters, and that's kind of problematic. So polling can be effective. I think what we're seeing now, different from 2016, for example, where the polls were really, really off, is that most of the quality polls, I would say, pretty much say that it's close race. That means that we don't know who's going to win any of these particular states because they're in the margin of error. The Trump campaign yesterday put out 17 polls showing that Donald Trump was leading and that Donald Trump was going to win in different states and around the country and all of that. And it was completely fabrication because what it was setting up this narrative that Donald Trump is leading and somehow now everything's being stolen. But the polls, for most part, were bogus and had no grasp of reality at all. So polling, I think, really has created more problems than it has resolved, principally because of the ideological use of polling rather than looking at polling as a ways of being able to measure certain trends, but doing it in particular kinds of ways that are helpful.
Dr. Anderson, your thoughts on what the results are showing now and the polling question?
Well, what the results are showing, I'm looking at what I concur with what Dr. Lucey said. The person that does the poll for the Des Moines Register, I know I think her name's Seltzer. She's a member of the National Communication Association. And as Dr. Lucey said, it was within the margin of error, in terms of over, under. And so I think that's probably where people were thinking, oh, Harris has a chance. And then the other thing is, I was surprised to see that poll because Iowa really hasn't been a pro-democratic state in some time. But I think the underlying thing, you have to refer back to what the professor said about the eugenics question. What I'm hearing as I've been traveling to different countries around the world, there's an existential kind of thing going on with people of European descent right now. And I think, and it goes back to this book that was out 100 years ago talking about the rising tide of color. Every country you go into, Germany, Italy, they're talking about how there's a dearth of basically white people having babies, the fear of African or Muslim immigrants coming in. But what I kind of see the elite of the West doing, I think they've decided that if you look at the leadership that they're elevating to countries in the West. And Kamala Harris is not an anomaly. You had Sunak, who was the prime minister of the UK. A black woman is now the leader of the Tory party.
Right.
I think the elites in the West want to co-opt kind of like that best and brightest, or what people used to call the talented 10th among the people of color population to maintain the institutional vibrancy of what people used to call the West, I think. But the point is, if in the next couple generations, key countries like America and some of these other countries are then become majority minority, is there such a thing as a West anymore? Okay. And so that is why they're in this existential crisis driven by these kind of techno autocratic capitalists like Elon Musk and them about having babies. Because I recall something Du Bois wrote in his book Dark Water about the psychology of the psychological wages of whiteness. Their entire identity is based upon their status in the world relative to black and brown and Asian people. And if it's no longer geographically situated in a certain way, they don't know what to do with themselves. Because in terms of how knowledge is produced, how it impacts geopolitics. But the same thing, the dearth of babies, is happening also in China and in Russia. Right now, I believe the most fertile woman in the world geographically is supposed to be a woman from Niger who has an average of 9 children. So what we're getting into now, I think, to answer the professor who talked about the eugenics question or raised that, we're in the area of science fiction now. In terms of, I know a recent Botswana writer wrote talking about African women earning a living by bearing children for Europeans. Because see, Africa is being confronted with the problem over the next 20, 30 years. They got to produce 20 million jobs a year to keep internal stability. And this is the same thing. And this is why Kamala Harris is going to have a tough time governing, because the coalition, if she wins tonight, is not built to govern. It's just built to stop Trump. But she's going to be the first American president that has to deal with the convergence of artificial intelligence, climate change, climate migration, and this massive debt that the country has at the moment. And usually, and ongoing pandemics, and a combination of just two of those things have been enough to take societies down. There's no historical record of a society dealing with those 4 or 5 crises at the same time. So the polling thing, I ignore the polling thing in terms of, I look at what they're actually saying in terms of the translated. Basically, I don't call them Republicans anymore. They're just a white nationalist party. And what's driving white nationalism internationally now, or fascism, is the birth question, where they're afraid of disappearing over the next 100 years, and the need for white homelands, and that's really why they want to force predominantly white women to have more babies when they pass a lot of these laws that are in terms of women's reproductive rights. And that's really what they're talking about at a lot of these white conferences, and this type of white international fascism, that the seeds were planted back in the 90s. And now it's just come to full fruition a generation later. And liberalism and progressivism does not have a language, as the professor talked about, to even deal with it. And that's why the world everybody on the call was born into between 1945 and 1990 is unraveling. And we're going back into this kind of pre-World War II era where we're seeing language that hasn't been used in 100 years reappearing in our public discourse in the midst of all this stuff. So now there are writers out there that talk about this kind of resorting of humanity, and this convergence of all these things is going to be sorted out over the next decade, but I'm not so sure it is. I'm not so sure it is. And so I'm just kind of in a wait and see attitude at the moment.
You're muted, Brian. You're muted. Brian, you're muted. Yeah. There you go.
Let me ask you guys another question in terms of having something to sort out, as Dr. Anderson was talking about. There have been 196 legal filings, with more on the way, in 40 states that have already alleged election fraud with no evidence yet, but they've already been filed. And I'm wondering if your thoughts on where we head after Election Day, if Kamala's elected and we have another, we're on the verge of another January 6th. I mean, is that something that's in the back of anyone's mind?
Oh, absolutely.
The Philadelphia DA already came out publicly and let the people in Pennsylvania know.
He sure did.
Right.
Go around and find out.
That's what he said. So, I mean, we aren't seeing those issues up here, but I think it's already going to leave a bad taste in people's mouth no matter what happens. I understand there were like 38 bombing threats in Georgia, some more in Arizona. So I think it's going to be ugly no matter who wins tomorrow. This is not going to be resolved anytime tomorrow. I mean, there's not going to be any coming together about this. I mean, simply because, particularly in the South, because then it becomes more than just a political issue. It becomes a civil rights issue of repression of Black voters. And I think what they're doing in Indian country at Navajo County out in Arizona, and then it depends on what Trump says tonight. They're saying some people are encouraging him at a certain time just to declare victory, that they're on the route to victory. And so, the next 2 or 3 hours here, we're going to have a clear picture who's probably on track to win, and because there are all these votes. A lot of the remaining vote is coming up out of the cities. Yeah. Those counties, the rural area votes and all that, that's about to dissipate within the next hour. And if in each of these cities, Atlanta, Philly, Detroit, Milwaukee, you're looking at a couple 100,000 more votes, she's going to win. And so, I don't know, we're just going to see it. And I guess people are going to have to hold their breaths. And I wouldn't be surprised. And hopefully no one's hurt. I know friends of mine have told me that the DC area National Guard elements are on standby to prevent something. So, we'll see what happens.
If I can say something about that,
I would say,
go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I just want to say this again. Maybe I'm a little bit at odds with, but there's a problem with the electoral system in the United States, with the way votes are cast and counted. We've known that since 2000. In 2000 and in 2004, the Democratic Party was probably cheated out of the election. In 2004, and the answer that happened in 2000, what they did in 2000 to solve the problem was to pass the Help America Vote Act, which actually created a system of contracting out to private vendors of electronic voting machines. That only made the system work. We have a system that's highly dependent on electronic.
That only made the system work or
worse? I'm sorry, worse. We now have a system in which most of the country depends on electronic voting machines, which are subject to undetectable fraud. As far as I'm concerned, we have a system of voting in the United States that is not trustworthy, and that's designed to enable fraud in various ways. And this is why we're going to have fights about this. In 2004, John Kerry lost Ohio, and it was contested, and there were votes that were contested, and they went in and they tried to look at the ballots and in one of the counties, and the guys in the ballot people said, no, we can't let you in because the FBI has said there's a terrorist threat against us and we can't let you in. And the FBI said, baloney, we didn't say that. And that's why John Kerry lost the election in 2004. And in 2005, as a result of that was contested by the Democrats. On January 6, 2005, Barbara Boxer, with the support of encouraged by civil rights people. The Democrats were all over this. We're all over the problem of electronic voting. And Barbara Boxer went into the Senate and said, we are not going to confirm the Electoral College vote. That's what the Democrats did in 2005. And between 2000 and 2020, you can find hundreds of Democratic activists and people writing and talking about the problem of the untrustworthiness of the American electoral system. 2016, it was kind of almost impossible not to see that Hillary cheated Bernie out of votes, only in the way out of the projections and the previous polling, only in states that had electronic voting machine. Anyway, I'm just saying, I don't know what's happening because nobody does. And if we just want to say, and you just cannot rule out, and that's what the Democrats have done since 2020. We can't talk or think about the problem of the American electoral system and the problem of the untrustworthiness that's really there. And therefore, we have fights after the election. You could fix this easily. I was part of an election monitoring system in Palestine. It was the most honest. Everybody who was there said it. They held the paper ballots up to everybody in the room. In the classroom, in the polling place, that's where votes should be counted. No votes should be moved around in boxes or trucks. You count the ballots in the vote in the precinct. You have paper ballots. This can be done. It's not hard, but they don't want to do it. They don't even want to talk about the Electoral College. The Democrats were Tim Walz talked about the Electoral College, and Kamala and the other Democrats told him to shut up. So they don't. There are problems that are obvious. And they were talked about.
Is Donald Trump right?
Now they don't want to talk about him anymore because Donald Trump said something about it.
Well, I'm asking, is Donald Trump right?
I don't know. About 2020?
Yes.
Where the election was decided by 44,000 votes in 3 states. Was it possible that the electronic voting systems in those states were either deliberately or accidentally wrong? They threw out 30% of the votes in the South Bronx in 2016, electronic voting machines, because there was a mistake. Nobody even talks about it because it was just the South Bronx. 30% of the votes. So my answer to the question is I don't know. And the trials that do this, you have to look at how these electronic systems work. The courts are never going to between the November 5th and January 20th. The courts cannot look into this. They can't do the real specific, detailed forensic work that needs to be done. Plus, some of it is undetectable. Joe Biden said that in 2016 or 2020 before the election. Oh, we have these electronic voting machines. They can do undetectable fraud. So we have a problem. If you have a system that's based on proprietary software, why should there be anything proprietary in a public system? What they've done is they've created a voting system based on for-profit private companies that use it to make profits using proprietary software and algorithms. So my answer to the question about 2020 is I don't know, and I don't think anybody does either. But the point is, whatever happened in 2020, as we're seeing now, any close election is going to be challenged. And instead of solving this problem between elections, which is the only time it can do, both parties, neither party really wants to solve the problem. They prefer to have these fights after the election, which creates chaos, creates divisiveness, creates division. But it's a mistake to take the position. We can't talk about. You can't accept the idea that there might have been any kind of electoral fraud, because it's just not true. We don't know.
Well, you make a good point, Jim. You make a good point. And I guess the question then for the next generation of politicians is going to be how do we fix it? What do we do?
Dr. Hussein, your thoughts.
I just want to say I was astounded that I thought maybe after 2020 they say, okay, we see the problem here. We have to fix these problems so people can have some real assurance that it's almost certainly true. I can see that there almost certainly no fraud here. That could be done. It could be done, but they didn't do it. They prefer to have the fights.
Well, they're not, you know what they're not putting on the screen? They're not putting up on the screen how many votes that Harris or Trump have lost to the Green Party candidate.
Yeah, I don't know.
I was just about to ask about these third-party
Yeah, this
installation
could come
of the Green
down to
Party can
like
take
some
place.
tens of thousands of votes. You know, Stein
Yeah.
could cost a victory in Michigan or in
He's on the
Pennsylvania.
ballot in Michigan, right?
But that's let me
I'm
just say
sorry.
make
Wait a minute.
How
Wait a
does
minute.
Steiner
Wait a
mean
minute. I
viable?
didn't understand what you said, Dr. Hussein.
No,
Say
I,
that again.
I was echoing Ronaldo that Jill Stein is on the ballot in Michigan.
yeah. And but what part of my analysis, and you can read the latest article on it, is with these electronic voting machines, these third-party votes become a kind of slush fund that you can move around. So if independent third parties, the Libertarians, the Greens, with the Reform Party, whatever, gets 4% of the vote, they move 2% of the vote to one of the other candidates, you'll never know it. And they can't complain. Nobody's going to complain. Nobody's going to look at it. And this is the kind of thing that the electronic voting system makes possible, and nobody even thinks about it or asks about it.
So, so let me say this. So, I don't know for sure. I think that electronic voting machines, because they're electronic, could be susceptible to some kind of incursion. But I don't think there's any universe in the galaxy in which the criticisms of Donald Trump have anything to do with him wanting a fairer voting system. I think that the lawsuits that were filed by the Republican Party, and they've said this, were to create the kind of chaos in the system so that it would provide more of an opportunity for them to claim that they've been cheated. And we know for sure that prior to electronic systems, the system still was being dishonest in many ways. With all the paper ballots in the world, people were still getting votes stolen. People were still getting denied their fair opportunity to be involved. I think what's required, and what I think there has been some effort to do, is to begin to take away states' rights as the means by which states can create these systems and begin to put in place and enforce policies that allow for more democratic, not small democratic, small d, democratic participation. When we look around the world, what I see are states where there is participation. You have automatic registration, for example, so that it isn't left up to the parties or left up to private groups to try to register people to vote. I think there is debate about whether people should be forced to vote, like in Brazil and some other places where there's actually penalties when people don't vote. But we could do a hell of a lot better at creating circumstances where people could vote that isn't subject to some sheriff in Nevada or some county clerk down in Mississippi. And so I think that's where the discussion has not taken itself. And even the degree to which some Democrats have tried to push legislation in Congress, it just has not gotten anywhere in the Senate or in the House.
How much longer is the Electoral College with us?
Forever.
And in my fantasy world of fantasy worlds, as much as I want Kamala to win the popular vote, and of course win the election, if this were a safe election and the other guy wasn't on the other side of the fence, how quickly would the right move to abolish the Electoral College if she were to lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College?
Yeah.
You know, that's the fantasy world that I wonder about. I was having a conversation with a guy the other day, and he's moaning and about needing some regulations now because CBS had some issues because Trump had some issues with CBS and 60 Minutes, and I'm thinking, I never hear a conversation about regulations any other time except when your side feels slighted. And I feel like this Electoral College is this is the albatross around our neck, basically since the beginning of our democratic times. And what does it take eventually rid ourselves of this. We've got this coalition of some states that have signed on to hand over their electoral college votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote, but they're not getting any more red states to sign on to that. Obviously,
Right.
What does it take to get rid of this, and how long is this with us?
Let me just point out, in 2020, when Trump was complaining about the election, and some of his people were starting to get on the Electoral College, Mitch McConnell got up and said, "We better not talk about the Electoral College because we'll never win another presidential election unless we have it."
Well, here's one of the blaring undemocratic elements of the Electoral College. For one candidate, they need 270 electoral votes to win. For the other candidate, they actually need 269 Electoral College votes. That's because the way the system is set up, if there's a 269 to 269 tie, it goes to Congress. The House votes on the president, the Senate votes on the vice president. When there's whatever party has the majority of state delegations, that's who's going to elect the president. The Republicans have 26 states where they dominate the delegation. The Democrats have 22, and there are 2 that are tied. That's probably not going to change a lot even after this election. So Donald Trump can get 269. There's a couple of ways that can happen, and it goes to Congress. And this is legitimized under the Electoral College. You could have Donald Trump voted president by the House, and you could have Tim Walz voted vice president by the U.S. Senate. So it's going to take a crisis probably of that level to demonstrate the gross and egregious undemocratic nature of the Electoral College. Washington, D.C. has no vote in the if it becomes a contingent election. Our 3 little electoral votes don't mean anything. It is the most unfair system on the planet for electing somebody to lead. But as I think Jim said, and I think as Jonathan was implying, the parties are invested in the Electoral College. So they're not putting any energy whatsoever, because then they would have to campaign in all 50 states. Now they campaign in 7 states. 90% of the money for this election went to these 7 states at the presidential level. So I don't think it's going to change unless we get a crisis of that level, because other than that, the parties and the elected officials don't see any personal benefit in another direction.
And it's also that focus on those 2 states is a focus on a few media markets. That's where all the media money goes to, all the media spending.
Yeah.
That's billions of dollars. They're going to spend, I think, $15 billion on this election. So they don't want to do away with that. They don't want to do away with the media consultant version of an election rather than a real election, popular election.
We're seeing Reverend Tony Lee join us now.
I'm going to have to.
Okay, Jim.
Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate inviting me. I hope.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
I hope I've been at least.
Thanks, Jim.
Engaged.
Yes, and engaging. Your perspective
Thank you,
is most
Jim.
welcome.
Thank you. Okay. How do I get out?
Is Reverend Lee there?
Well, Brian, why don't you work towards final thoughts from the guests?
Okay, well, let's do that. Let me ask each of you your thoughts. We talked a lot about a lot of stuff tonight, a lot of stuff to consider. But let me ask you where you'd like to be in the morning.
Hey guys, before we do final,
We got Dara Kennedy coming back to us from Howard. Dara, go ahead.
That's right. Hey guys, before we get to final thoughts, I want to make sure that we bring in now Senator-elect Angela Brooks Number one, surrogate Reverend Tony Lee from the state of Maryland. I think we just got him. She just wrapped up her speech. I think Reverend Tony Lee is in our waiting room. If we can ping him in. We just saw the new senator-elect make her acceptance speech, her victory speech. And of course, we know that is quite a historic moment. We're just dealing with history today. It's quite a historic moment. There he is. I think Reverend Tony Lee. We got you there, Reverend.
Yes, can you hear me?
We'll figure out the technology.
Here we
Yes,
go.
we can hear you. We can't see you. There we go. We can hear you. Right. Well, number one, we should say congratulations to you and your team. You guys have been working so hard for now Senator-elect Angela Alsobrooks, who won that race in Maryland, defeating Larry Hogan of all people.
Congratulations.
It is incredible. Thank you so much. It is incredible. And the excitement here is just amazing. You can just cut it with a knife. And so we are just so excited here in Maryland for our Senator-elect Angela Alsobrooks.
Somebody needs to mute their phone. Tony, what was the vibe like in that room? Because she went up against a two-time former governor and Larry Hogan. That was not an easy race for you all.
I mean, it wasn't an easy race. It wasn't an easy primary against Trone, who was a multimillionaire who spent $1 gazillion, against Larry Hogan, who was someone who was extremely well known in this region. But it was the power of the people, and that money couldn't beat the people. And that's what you felt in the room. You felt a room of people who organized, the people from the grassroots all the way to the grass tops, who came together, who believed in a leader who we felt was best for our families, best for our community, and who was one of us. And I think that was the blessing of it all. And that's what you felt in the room, was that the people felt like their voice was heard in the state of Maryland.
Well, we wrap up on a very positive note. Congratulations again. That certainly was a tough race, and glad to see you came out on top. I believe we're going to be wrapping up the show in about a minute. But thanks to all of the guests for joining us, Dr. Sherman, Clarence, Dr. Anderson, Reverend Lee, all of you, for Wilmer Leon, Dr. Wilmer Leon, Derek Kennedy, and Jonathan Clark. Thanks to all of you for being a part of this. Dr. Sherman, I missed if I left you out. A great conversation. We'll see where everybody is in the morning. I wish all of you well, and on that, I believe we will say good night.
Night, everyone.
Take care now. God bless.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, how did it go?
All right.
I thought it went pretty well.